Yeah, it's John Reed, and I have commandeered another deserted room, and I have my partner in crime, aka sometimes called the cowboy, Brian Sommer. What up?
Hi, howdy.
I saw you shaking your
and
head.
John, welcome to Texas.
We are in Texas, right?
Yeah.
So we are trying to make sense of a day and a little more at ZohoDay, action-packed. And I think the interesting part about our gathering here is this is very much an intentional enterprise Zoho gathering. So Zoho is doing a different SMB analyst event in the fall. And so Zoho spent the last day really making the case for being an enterprise player. And that was ambitious of them, and it was interesting. And there was also a whole heck of a lot of AI talk, as you were pointing out. In fact, AI kind of threatened to derail everything else as usual. So
it would be the first vendor event where AI became, it wasn't just the topic du jour, it was the only topic du jour.
Right.
Here, I'd say it was probably 80% of the conversation focused on that.
Well, why don't we start with the overall enterprise play? I did a short panel discussion with Zoho leadership on that this morning, and I was joking about it because in preparation for it, I made a list of like 20 or 25 points around what it takes to like be an enterprise grade vendor. Because we've seen a lot of smaller cloud ERP vendors, for example, trying to make this push. And so I have all these elaborate criteria I set out, and I didn't cover hardly any of them today, but some of them were actually funny because they were like unwanted criteria, like, you're an enterprise player when your UX is degraded through too many rapid fire acquisitions and your partner morale and your partner community goes to crap and you got big and different SIs. So there are dangers of moving up market too. But how do you sort of assess this in terms of like where Zoho's at and also how you think they did? Because this is not an easy case for them to make.
So I think Zoho definitionally has a little bit, I'd say, less spectacular kind of set of size constraints, whatever, around what they would define as an enterprise. And that's fine. Because frankly, it's a space that any employer of, say, 1,000 people and beyond is often considered enterprise level. But that also means you're lumping in employers who have 500,000 or 1 million employees or something like that. And there's a lot of differences in that broad kind of group. The other thing is, of these larger enterprises, it's one thing for many of them to be multinationals who have operations in, say, 4, 5, 10 countries. That's a level of difficulty in and of itself. But then to get someone who's operating in over 100 countries and territories, that's a whole nother ballgame. So they're clearly on the lower end of that range, but that still means they had customers that they shared with us under NDA that have many thousands and thousands of employees. And I did like, believe it or not, I liked how they were approaching a number of big global firms by dealing with their Asian kind of subsidiaries or divisions and what have you first, and kind of capture the local kind of versions of these companies, then expand outward from there. And it seems to be working.
Yeah, and Zoho's a company that doesn't talk a lot on the record about its growth numbers and stats. So they gave us a bunch of stuff, but it's not stuff we can really share publicly. But I think that the gist of it is that Zoho is interesting amongst vendors in its space where it's got such a big global footprint of smaller businesses that it has a fair amount of protection against the headwinds of the market. And it gives them some freedom as a privately held company to pursue the enterprise in a Zoho type of way. The question is, how does that pan out? And I think you joined later in this session, but this morning during the breakout sessions, I got some of the most convincing sort of data points from the customer that presented that was talking about, for example, they're running SAP and Oracle, but they actually turned to Zoho Expense because, quite simply, it was better, easier to use, cheaper, integrated well, and deploying it at scale and dramatically reducing the time and hassle of, the expense management scenarios that a large company with a big global footprint and 3,000 plus users has to offer. But what was interesting about the Zoho Enterprise play in that context is they're not at the point where they're trying to get companies to rip out SAP and Oracle, though they have a little bit of stories around some of that, but they really want to coexist, but then start making the case for what else can you do with Zoho internally now that you have, say, Zoho Expense in place or whatever.
Well, years ago, I remember meeting with two different large enterprise vendors in the same day. And both of them were almost paranoid that the other might get a toehold into their account. And maintaining account control is an obsession with vendors who have large enterprise accounts. These things are expensive to sell and close and implement, and they also tend to hang on to those solutions for a long, long time. I think a major vendor that doesn't see Zoho becoming a potential threat is underestimating Zoho. And I mean that in the most complimentary way around Zoho. And it's fine that they can find entry points into some of these large enterprises. But I'd say make no mistake, they're going to expand geographically the same module, if you will, throughout a customer. They can also expand functionally with all kinds of extra tools, utilities, as well as other applications. They're not going to just sit still. It's not going to be, and part of that is because they have a cost structure that is so ridiculously low that gives them an opportunity to get in with these companies. And what's going to happen in a lot of these firms, like one of my clients, they had 16 global CIOs in that company, and they meet every month or two. And what do they talk about? They talk about how they're getting reamed over on a contract negotiation or an upgrade fee or whatever. They also talk about we just got some new stuff like from a Zoho at a price point that just makes my budget problems go away. So again, are they quite fully ready for all things enterprise globally at the super big E enterprise level? No. Are they directionally going that way? Yes. And that's what I'm seeing.
So when you say that you think vendors underestimate Zoho, what do you think they underestimate about Zoho?
I think they discount Zoho's, they don't understand Zoho's cost structure and pricing structure. And I think they try to cast Zoho as, if it's that low cost, it can't be that good. And I think that's the way they position against Zoho. And I think I think the smart buyers are realizing that's bullshit. And that's a fake positioning that competitors trying to foist on that can't be withstood.
So, and I think one of the things I would add to that, and I do think, we'll probably get into some of the challenges Zoho faces also, but in terms of what vendors underestimate about Zoho, one things I would add to that is Zoho has got a really coherent, unified data platform that is built all of its applications on. And that's actually kind of a big deal because as Zoho begins to articulate this sort of comprehensive approach to AI along with low code and workflow automation and stuff like that, what it means is that if a business user builds like an app for their industry or whatever, using low code. And we saw an example of this. Someone literally, their business users built their own vertical add-on to Zoho. It's going to be provisioned with all the security, role-based access, all of that other stuff is built into that, like, building blocks of building an app. So it's not just like you and me going to our hotel room tonight and like creating some, low-code app online. This has got all the Zoho provisions inside of it. I think that's a pretty big deal because it means not only can you move quickly, but you can do it in the context of an overall platform. And that would be, I think, where vendors should be careful with Zoho, because that gives them a lot of flexibility to, for example, when we got into some of the vertical discussions, it gives them a lot of flexibility to work with a customer, and suddenly they're building out some vertical, and now they're saying, hey, this could be a good vertical for us to play in. Let's work with more companies in this vertical, you know?
The vertical stories were really kind of interesting because they involved some very big companies with some very core mission critical kind of applications. And I'm not saying, I don't want a listener to think that they're coming out with something that can replace a gigantic, like, fully automated factory of the future, integrated, manufacturing kind of world, digital manufacturing kind of environment. You could with enough time, money, but no, but we're talking about a number of very painful, bespoke, custom kind of apps that companies have had for a long time. And we may start seeing a lot more of those getting replaced out with, as you correctly point out, the whole integrated tool set that Zoho's got.
And there were some anecdotes around the field views on the dealer management system was an example of, one company built it, but now, okay, let's look at other companies in that sort of financial supply chain, if you will, and like put in that type of solution for them. And so it's really interesting. The only thing that I found missing, and I did like the vertical discussions here, because in the past, we didn't hear nearly enough from Zoho around their industry plays. And I tend to think the future of the markets they're targeting, especially in that mid-level enterprise market, does require that industry focus. So I was really glad to hear about it. I want to hear more around getting industry leaders in those verticals together in the auspices of Zoho to talk about how those industries are changing, because I think so much of this feels like a platform and technology play, and I want to see them also develop the credibility to have industry conversations, because the thing is, Brian, to your point around cost structure, they could potentially have those conversations, whereas in the past, when you brought those leaders together, they would say, well, I'd love to do that, but I can't afford it even if it could. But with Zoho, you could have those conversations and say, hey, what if we had an aggregated supplier marketplace for this vertical or whatever? A bunch of different suppliers need this. We never worked together before. Zoho could probably build that for you, right? And so let's have these conversations, because I think too much right now is just about AI instead of looking at how is our industry changing and what firms can we align ourselves with as a customer to help us cope with these changes. And I'd like to see Zoho in their verticals be able to have those kinds of discussions. So I think there's a human and community element in play, not just a platform. So I'd like to hear more about that in the future. But
well, then if I could add, one of the things I want to hear is, I didn't hear anything really about how any of those vertical deals get monetized either by Zoho or by members of the ecosystem that are volunteering their intellectual property or their guidance and putting together, whether that's a partner or a customer themselves. But, we were only in this for about a day and a quarter, whatever, so we can't get all answers to all questions right away. So that's a follow-up knit, not a product line kind of deal. Well, I think we've given the listeners a bit to think about here, but the bottom line on this is the vertical stories were, I think, a pleasant surprise because of the magnitude of the kinds of change they're bringing into those companies, and the fact that most of these are starting off in countries like India, where Zoho has a huge local presence and a technology presence there, and they're getting leveraged out from the subcontinent and beyond through Asia, and are getting picked up and are going to propagate themselves through other portions of those same customers. And that'll be something to really watch and see how that unfolds in subsequent Zoho encounters.
Yeah, and this segues a little bit into our AI conversation with Zoho, because I've written about Zoho's AI approach in the past, and one of the things I really like about Zoho, and Sridhar Vembu, the CEO who's moving on from that role into more of a product and research role again, a lot of that I think is motivated by what he's seeing in AI and the impact of that for Zoho. And it's interesting to think about that, because I walked up to you when you were doing your classic, I think you were talking to Raju, but you were doing one of your classic, like, Brian, gives the tough love, like, feedback thing. And you were talking about just the impact of Zoho's cost structure and how much it could potentially drive adoption, but then also the challenges with, like, buyers that have inertia, for example, and aren't really moving ahead as aggressively as they could. Like, how do you deal with that? But I think the AI part is really interesting, because it creates a potential segue between, like, helping companies to understand this is not just like you said, it's not just a cheaper option, but from an AI perspective, it could be a pretty sophisticated option for you. That Zoho's really done a lot of work. They do work with external LLMs and provide a lot of choice there for companies in terms of which ones they want to use, but they've also built a lot of their own models. They've worked a lot with right-sizing models. When you talk with Zoho, you can tell they've been very deep in the experimentation on exactly what AI can and can't do. And that can't part is pretty important too.
Is it can't or shouldn't?
Right. Some combination of the two, right?
Yeah.
Like, and some things that you simply shouldn't do with AI for whatever reason. Do you want to talk a little bit about your take on their messaging and what they had to say on AI?
So we got a lot on that. And frankly, I could steer you guys. You could read the press release that they issued this week on it. It talks about Zia, which is an AI technology they introduced in 2015, as well as Zia Agents, Agentics, the Agent Studio, Agent Marketplace, and so forth. Just to sum that up, we saw a really cool tool that would build agents for you, which was really kind of neat. And it's using no-code, low-code kind of technology. From that, once you build an agent, you can also park it in the marketplace for others to take advantage of, if you like. How you make that available and the monetization of it, I didn't get a chance to get into. There's more, though. I mean, they have all these productivity tools and capabilities that go with it. They had some slides that were things that I wish every vendor could replicate. For example, they had some that showed all the different kinds of tools. And I mean, the slide was completely filled with all kinds of tools. They had others that were things that, what do you call them? Drawing a blank here. They had they called them contextual. That's the thing. And the contextual AI capabilities were just everywhere in the product line. They show up in all kinds of functions. And I even heard one of the Zoho executives tell someone out in the hall that most of the people have no idea that there is actual AI work going on in that little bit of functionality that the user is engaging with. They have skills AI tools, and these are tools that do things like grammar correction and help you either write something or craft something or complete math problems or any number of things that they're designed around skill sets. They have another one which is around building tools, and they had one where a user took an image and snapped it, and so you're dealing with an image and not a live piece of code. It's just a picture. And from that, you just tell this AI tool, build me an app or form using this image as the template. And in about 2.5 seconds, there was a completed app that figured out the labels, the fields, everything else, and made an app that looked just like the image that was snapped and put in there. So, I mean, they have all those kind of things, and the stuff is just prevalent all throughout the product line.
So I want to walk the listeners through a few highlights from Sridhar's keynote on AI, and then you can add some color to that, because I thought he made some pretty important points that are pretty timely with the impact of DeepSeek, which has undermined a lot of assumptions in the market around the cost structures, especially around training AI. Zoho has been critical of the big AI sort of over-the-top infrastructure-oriented, spend billions on data centers kind of AI for a long time. So I think Sridhar he referred to it as the AD era that we're in now after DeepSeek, but his contentions here are that essentially LLM reasoning engines are a commodity, and that features are table stakes, and the companies won't be able to charge a lot for it, which is referring to the $1 trillion market hit that a lot of these companies took. And by reasoning, I that's a problematic term for me, but he's talking about essentially that LLMs are pretty sophisticated at the time of inference at trying to make sure that they're serving up something that's relevant to your query. So it goes through a few different steps, basically. So he asked the question then, well, where is the value, right? And so what he said was the value is in the specific business data and context of you as a customer, combined with the commodity reasoning engines. And he talked about in that context how there are problems, though. So a conventional database, for example, allows you to update or delete facts you've already entered.
Right.
And he asked, how do you delete information from an LLM? How can you be sure that it's actually been deleted? And what kind of trouble does that get you into with current compliance issues? And one of the conclusions that he's drawn from that is this mandates the so-called RAG architecture, which is essentially the idea that you avoid some of those problems by bringing in customer data only through the context window. So it's through essentially an extended prompt scenario. It never becomes part of the LLM. So that helps you to avoid some of the problems of putting customer data into an environment where if you needed to take something out later, it becomes pretty difficult. I thought that was all very interesting. I would have some additional criticisms and context and observations, but I thought that was a really interesting way he framed it. And the other point that Sridhar made is he's particularly interested in the developer part of it, because code syntax is fairly easily checkable by machines and other machines to find problems with the code. And so he thinks the developer productivity numbers around Gen AI when it moves forward are going to be quite exceptional. Now, we could have some longer discussions about what developers in the field have found so far, but he's very optimistic and focused, I think, a fair amount on that. Zoho as a company is looking at a much broader thing, but one of the key points that Sridhar made was that ROI is affected by the need to review Gen AI output. And he's absolutely 100% right about that. And though I would say it depends a little bit on the scenario. So for example, if you have an automatic invoice recognition Gen AI program, and what you need to do is make sure that it populated the fields correctly, that affects ROI, but still a human could pretty quickly hit approve on, say it's a certain, level of ticket where you above 10,000, you have to have a human review it or whatever. That affects ROI too. But what really affects ROI is the examples I've seen lately where someone was showing off like, OpenAI's operator can generate all this research for me. And I'm sitting here thinking, if I use that for an article, I would have to literally verify all of it. I mean, I lose all of the ROI. Correct. So it depends a little bit on the type of human review, but that was sort of his point. So with all of that kind of said, what What was your big takeaways from what he had to say?
So the program productivity point got pounded in pretty good. I mean, they were talking 10 to 100x kind of improvement levels are possible. And that could have some rather substantial impacts, obviously, on the profession. And it made me ask a question privately to one of the executives. If you believe that's true, then why does Zoho still have that training academy going on to create next-gen kind of programmers in India? And, typical me, I would be the one who puts those two data points together.
Wow, aren't you a little troublemaker, huh?
So that's one point, but let's move past that. The real thing here is I actually agree with him that the improvements in programmer productivity are going to cause just an explosion of potential new product coming out. Because a lot of what AI can do for programming is sort of like what we experienced after the initial creation of computing in the 50s, 40s, and 50s. It took time until we got to some programming languages, so you didn't have to develop everything with machine code or hard wiring a computer. So it was these powerful languages with names like, COBOL and all that kind of stuff, assembler language. That's what caused a huge productivity boost. Then we saw a huge explosion of code and commercial applications go out. What we've got right now is this AI stuff is just continuing to democratizing programming is what's going on. And I don't see that. I don't see any kind of change on that happening. What I did find interesting was this side conversation of sorts that was going on the big stage, where there were Zoho execs were drawing parallels between what happened when farmer productivity went through the roof through incredible amounts of mechanization, starting really in about the 40s in earnest, and how it really drove down the numbers of farmers out there. The same thing happened with mechanized textile mills, and it pretty much got rid of the home weaver kind of market. And I think what we're going to see is a concentration of power in a few companies that will control a huge amount of these AI and programming kinds of capabilities. And this is the time for Zoho to get out there and grab all the land and market share they can for this kind of space, because it's going to get tight.
Yeah, and I think the biggest counter I have to some of that in an enterprise context is that there are folks like Satya Nadella of Microsoft who maintain that these systems can essentially learn business logic and build their own sort of software, so you really won't need SaaS anymore and stuff like that. I don't buy it. I think what's going to be interesting, and I think where Zoho could excel, is engaging subject matter and domain experts in the process of building software in a really seamless kind of a way. So if you're a CFO, you tell your Gen AI engine, here's what I want. Like, this is the kind of expense management I want. I want it to connect to these two systems. I want it to do this and that for me. And I want it to be blah, blah, blah in these regions. And then essentially generate the code for that and give it to a couple of senior developers, and build it. And I think Zoho is Zoho's architecture is heading towards that, right? So in the past, that would have required 50 developers and a bunch of as-is, to-be conversations and requirements gathering and all that shit. In the so-called future of it, as I see it, you connect the domain experts directly with that interface. The code gets outputted, and it probably needs some tweaking, but you only need a couple of senior developers to do that. So that's how I see it. Anyway, I think Zoho's got a big opportunity in that area.
So let's temper that just a little bit. I think they have actually a huge opportunity in some of the vertical areas for this, because the logic for a lot of that is not regulated. It's not as torturous as what you find with, say, the preparation of financial statements. And I know you and I've had a spirited bunch of pieces we did when Klarna, I think it was,
Right.
was talking about we're going to get rid of Workday and Salesforce. And I pointed out in my whatever rebuttal to that concept that just show me how AI can write an entire financial statement report. It's going to take a while before they can crack that code on that. But I do believe they can crack all kinds of other kinds of capabilities and knock those right out of the park. So
yeah, I was just using that as an example. It could be a retail expert. It could be, and when we talked about this with Zoho later, they're very much thinking similarly in that they don't really want to get into super heavily regulated vertical areas because it's not as easily transferable for them, which makes sense, right? So healthcare is one example of where all the hoops you have to jump through, and it's not just the regulations. It's the resulting data silos and legacy software systems that are part of that industry, part and parcel of all that regulation, right? So Zoho's going to find other places to play, but I still think that type of future to me, where essentially the AI becomes this sort of intermediary between a business user and a developer, I think could be pretty promising. And to me, that resonates a lot more than a lot of the automagical bullshit that I hear about, it's just going to write itself. It's going to understand all the business rules itself. It's like, I'm sorry, but I don't believe that. I think a lot of the nuances of how to get business done are actually in people's heads. And the challenge is getting that into software. And if you could do that quickly, I think that would be really cool. But
I'm sitting here kind of chuckling as you're saying that, because I kept thinking about something earlier in my career where I had to read all these insurance regulations on how to price out policies. And every state had its own collection of funky-licious kind of weird coverages and pricing protocols and so forth. And not only that, but every insurance company's got their own underwriting rules. And anyhow, one of the things that stood out in my mind was this thing in Louisiana called windstorm pool indicators. And you had to know, which side of a levee is your house on determined whether you could even get insurance or not and how much it was going to be. And imagine trying to come up with programmatic logic for that in days before there was even GPS.
Yeah.
So now where I'm going with this whole point is, I think the real opportunity that's understated here, it's not rebuilding the same vertical solution we've had for the last 50 years. Let's reimagine what that could work like and how it could be done a whole lot better now that we have, like in the case with the insurance, a GPS capability to go with it.
But see, that's exactly why I like that idea of taking it directly from someone's ideas, right? Where this is how I'd like my software to work. And then that becomes code, right? That's really interesting because a lot of, for example, Phil Wainwright on Diginomica has been writing a lot about his fear that we're just going to end up automating old legacy processes.
Yeah, we're repaving the cow path to make it repaving it to be a cattle superhighway. I mean, it's just a faster, slicker version of the same old stuff. And that's not going to move the needle. The good news is clients seem to be very interested in doing things. They want a quantum jump because they've learned through experience that whatever system they put in place is going to have to last at least a decade or more. So they want, in this rapidly changing and rapidly obsolescing world of technology, they want something that's got some longevity in front of it. They need to see the runway in front of this product, not look backwards and see where they came from.
So we're in the final thoughts phase of our podcast, Brian, because we are just about out of time. It took us 3 weeks to actually get in the same room together. Though,
we've had some travel problems.
Yeah, we have.
Sure.
The winter event circuit has not been smooth, and I'm not sure that our flights home are going to be smooth either. And you're heading to New York, and I'm not sure that's going to be smooth.
No, I think I'm gonna regret not going home tonight. Anyway.
But yeah, so although we did do an Acumatica review virtually last week for listeners who want to check that out, because Brian made that show and I did not. Anyway, so the final sort of thoughts here. I think my final thought is I thought Zoho made a really interesting case for being an enterprise player, and it will just be very interesting to follow like what they do. And I think the more creativity they can apply to, like we were discussing, to changing how things are done, the better it will be, because I think a lot of enterprises really would prefer a software vendor, like you said, that's not only cheaper, but less friction, better to deal with, better aligned with what they're trying to do. How Zoho is going to do that from a partner angle could be a whole separate podcast in terms of, I do think they need to find some partners that are not big SIs, but that are very vertically oriented. And they have found some of them, but I think project quality is going to be an issue as they grow. And I'm a big advocate of building out more technology to monitor project health, but I think that'll be an interesting topic. So if we left anything out of this discussion, I would say it's the role of partners in all of this. But otherwise, hey, man, we only had so much time we could allot to this and cover all this information. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on?
I think the one thing that none of the other analysts or even anyone's really talking about explicitly, but I think we need to get it out there. I remember some of the first contacts I had with this firm, and I think you were there as well, like in Pleasanton, California. And dealing with Zoho back then, they were I would call it, they were in this young teenager kind of mode. They'd had success with some of their other businesses. They thought they knew a lot about the apps marketplace, but I don't think they understood, let's say, like the North American, European market, maybe, as well as some of the analysts in the room. And so there was a lot of this kind of growing pains, awkwardness, whatever, in the beginning. I mean, they've always been super nice people, don't get me wrong, but these software companies go through these maturation levels. This event the last couple of days here made me think of, this is a different kind of Zoho. Nothing about the culture's changed or anything else. It's still what it was. It's just the level of maturation of the company and the product lines has gone up quite a bit. And I think anybody who thinks of them as they were just a kind of a low-cost vendor that provided software to startups or whatever, is really just doesn't understand how much they've grown up. Guys like you and I, we're always going to be nitpicking at things from every vendor out there, and Zoho will be no exception. But this commercial growth of the company, when I look back over the last decade, it's been rather astonishing how much it's come along.
Indeed. We'll stop it there for now, but thanks, Brian, for the review of ZohoDay 2025. Good luck on your travels.
Thanks. You too.